reoccurring theme of 2017 has been the cry of white nationalism. Many people on the left were, and some still are, convinced that Trump is a white supremacist. And his appointment of Steve Bannon made those same people even more convinced the White House was being led by evil racists. This, combined with the Trump rallies and the publicity the media has given to the alt-right, has made 2017 a weird time for race relations in America. For me personally, I found that I have, for the most part, been stuck in the middle of two extremes. I see on the one hand people who want to separate people based on race and simply assume white people should be treated as second-class citizens due to their supposed superiority they call privilege. And on the other, I see people who think white people have superiority and therefore think everyone else should be second-class citizens. Of course, when I talk to people in real life, I find very few have any interest in talking about these things at all, and most seem to fall much more in the middle of these two extremes, just as I am myself. So in an attempt to help better shape my beliefs on this topic, I decided I should do more research and learn more about the reasons society is the way it is, and hopefully answer the question of why people are so different, or rather, if people are inherently different, then find out why such people will at times act so much alike. So I decided to start the journey by reading Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. When I was in school, I heard the book get referenced a lot, on many occasions, but it was never required reading, so I never bothered to actually read it before now. In the book, Diamond argues that the advances in European technology came not because of some genetic superiority, but rather because of environmental factors that favored that region. This is essentially what I was taught in school as well, not just in terms of curriculum, but also from experience. Having grown up in a large city, I attended schools with lots of diversity. One thing that I couldn't help but notice is that while certain stereotypes did stick out as generally true, they were never universally true. So while it was generally true that Asians were good at math, there were several people that I knew who were exceptions to this, and of course, there were many non-Asian students who were also good at math. But these differences could theoretically be explained by either genetics or culture. I also noticed, while I was in school, people tended to self-segregate, not necessarily on racial lines, although that happened to a large extent as well, but generally people would segregate based on personality, which makes sense. People want to be around others who think like them and have similar interests. But of course, whether people are segregating with those that really act like them, or whether they are instead forming groups and then acting more like those other people in order to fit in, is something I can't really answer from my experience alone. But one thing was clear, which was that stereotypes can lead to incorrect assumptions as often as they lead to correct ones. Diamond's book reinforces this idea by providing an account of history that explains the differences in society without assuming some non-proven genetic starting point. Of course, such an argument does not disprove genetic differences, but it provides an adequate explanation that doesn't require genetic differences, which means if such differences exist after all, then it would still require breaking down the past in order to determine how much of the success of Europe was due to genetics and how much was due to environment. And of course, if no such genetic differences exist, that is to say, there are no genetic differences between different races in terms of how our brains work, then we have a reasonable and perhaps complete explanation. Although it's also possible that such differences exist but create differences that don't advantage one over another, such as if one race was better at problem solving and another was better at memory or something like that. So what specifically does Diamond argue? Well, first off, he addresses the proximate cause of the events which led to European power expansion and colonialism. Mainly, as the title of the book suggests, these proximate causes were guns, germs, and steel. However, that's probably obvious to most people who have a decent understanding of history, so he doesn't just stop there. Diamond also attempts to address the ultimate cause of these events. Basically, his argument comes down to geography, although politics also plays a role. By producing guns, the society has the advantage of superior weaponry. The manufacturing of steel allowed for stronger armor that provided little match for enemies with stone weapons, and germs, which left native populations weakened and in some cases decimated, allowed for greater conquest with less resources. But of course, one might still wonder why germs wouldn't be a two-way street. Why would I bring diseases that killed natives, and those natives not have germs that have the same effect on me? The answer to that question seems to be food production, which led to people spending time in close proximity to animals. In order to produce larger amounts of food and sustain the population, Europeans relied heavily on animals, not just in terms of eating, but also for tasks such as plowing fields. The Europeans had built up immunity to these diseases that other people had not, and those same people didn't have livestock, so therefore didn't have comparable diseases. While this explains how the Europeans came to colonize much of the world, the proximate cause, it doesn't explain why the Europeans came to be the most successful at conquering, the ultimate cause. Diamond's argument centers around the orientation of the continents. Europe has the rare advantage of having an east-west orientation. This allows for crops and animals to be relocated throughout the continent without much trouble. since climate doesn't change all that much when you move along lines of latitude. However, when you travel north to south just a little, the change in climate is generally much more great. This makes it harder to move plants and animals amongst continents where the land mostly stretches north to south. So while Asia and Europe, and a small part of North America, have a nice east-west orientation that results in moderate climate, the other continents, as well as North America as a whole, have north-south axes and therefore made trade and relocation more difficult. Of course, these are oversimplifications, and geography as a whole, including access to rivers for shipping cargo, play a large role as well. And of course, politics also plays a role. While North America had an area that would have been equally beneficial, the lack of complex political systems and trade kept the Native Americans from inventing technologies that might have led to the world being colonized by Native Americans had history played out differently. This is even more evident when looking at Europe and Asia. Europe had a great deal of competition, which led to innovation, and that led to neighboring societies adopting these innovations because if they hadn't, they would have lost out to those that did. This, combined with a relatively large amount of coastline, helped Europe become seafaring and to eventually colonize much of the world. However, this didn't happen in Asia, mostly due to political unification. While this unification helped in some ways to create peace, which helped lead to some innovations, the lack of competition didn't create nearly as much pressure or opportunity to innovate. Diamond gives the example of Christopher Columbus, who tried to get his expedition funded by several rulers before finally going to the monarch of Spain, who funded his trip and eventually led to the founding of the United States. If Europe had been politically unified, my country might not exist today. But what does the axis of the continents have to do with anything? Diamond argues that the ability to relocate plants and animals is essential for large-scale food production. If you have a society with a growing population, you'll need more and more food over time. If, however, you only have a small area where the food being produced can grow, then you'll have a smaller potential to grow because of the limit on the food that can be produced. But a society that has the ability to expand to a larger amount of land where the native food can be produced will have a higher carrying capacity for their population, which will allow for greater population growth. This doesn't mean that a society can't overcome this obstacle, but the more time they spend on acquiring and planting new crops relative to competing nations means the less time they'll have to innovate compared to those other nations. And on top of this, food production creates a positive feedback loop. The more food that is produced, the more people that can be fed, which means the more population growth, which means the need for even greater supply of food. So it seemed that European superiority was not due to genetic superiority, but rather a geographic accident. However, none of this is to say that Europeans weren't hardworking or didn't have anything useful to contribute. While the geographic advantages helped Europeans dominate the world, their innovations and hard work were still the result of individuals working hard and solving problems and creating not just advanced technology, but also advanced political and social systems. It just means that other individuals who worked just as hard didn't have the advantages and therefore were less likely to have created the same level of advancements, which is why those cultures didn't end up being the ones to colonize the world. I mean, if you were born in a nomadic society without written language, you probably won't have the free time to invent capitalism or farming tools or irrigation systems. However, a society that spends less time trying to acquire food will have more ability to innovate, especially if there are external pressures to do so, such as competition from neighboring nations or the occurrence of harsh winters that require hard work to survive. I think it's also worth noting that while it may look to some like Europeans were just colonizing monsters, the fact is conquest has been a regular part of history. We need look no further than the conquests of Muhammad, which helped spread Islam into Asia and Africa, as well as Chinese imperialism with military expansion. These examples show us that conquering land has been a regular part of history throughout the world. It also shows us how we all, regardless of race, seem to have the same propensity for evil, and I think we also have the same propensity for kindness, which has allowed us to do away with, or at least deter, the terrible mistakes of the past, such as slavery and military conquest. At the end of the day, even if genetic differences do exist, it really doesn't even matter. First off, because the events of history could be explained without such differences, and so any account of history that assumes those things would require a wealth of data to prove that it's a better fit for how things actually happened, or else those genetic differences would have to be proven to not just exist, but to have existed to the same extent in the past. But also because of such differences still allow for individuals within different racial groups to defy the stereotypes, that it makes no sense to judge people based on those statistics that won't be true for them. So it makes no sense to hold people back or exclude someone from an activity or job simply because on average, people who look like this hypothetical person won't typically succeed, because the statistics don't tell you anything about the individual's chance of success. So we can't hold people back or keep anyone down simply because of how they were born. People have agency, and so we must treat them based on their actions and personal choices and not innate characteristics. I think the only fair and reasonable approach is to hold everyone to the same standards, and then people will succeed or fail based on their own merit. Overall, Guns, Germs, and Steel isn't a complete account of history, it's a simplification of past events, but it still sheds a great deal of insight on how and why different peoples ended up the way they did. It, of course, doesn't prove that all people are the same, but it does provide a reasonable account of how people of the same species came to be so vastly different over the course of human history. It is alone not much proof of anything, but for me, the book is just a stepping stone, the first of many that I plan to read to better advance my knowledge on the topic. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think by rating this video and leaving a comment. You can subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. You can also follow me on social media. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching, and remember to never stop questioning.